Welcome back again to episode number 37 of Solving Basketball. I'm Jordan Sperber, and in today's episode, I'm joined by Ben Falk. I'm guessing most of you are already familiar with Ben and his work, but if not, he started in the NBA initially as an intern for Dean Oliver with the Nuggets, and he went on to work for the Trailblazers and the Sixers. With the Sixers, he was vice president of basketball strategy. Since leaving the NBA, he started Cleaning the Glass, an NBA website, which, again, a lot of you are probably familiar with. But if you're not, and you're a college basketball fan, I guess the most similar thing to the stats aspect of Cleaning the Glass is KenPom. His work with Cleaning the Glass, both content-wise and business model-wise, was a big inspiration for me with Hoop Vision. When I was talking to people about the idea early on, I kind of compared it to an NCAA version of Cleaning the Glass. And he's been kind enough over the last year or two to let me run some business ideas by him. Really, our conversations offline are usually more business strategy related than basketball strategy, although, we sometimes talk some basketball too. One of the other things besides Cleaning the Glass that he currently does is coach a high school basketball team. He's a head coach. And I think we're both really interested in the different levels of basketball. He has the NBA experience, I have more college experience, and then all the way on down, how these different levels are similar, are different. And that's what we talk about on this podcast. We start out with some of Ben's background, how he got into the NBA, and things like that. But then we get into the weeds on what he's doing with his high school team, coaching wise, and comparing and contrasting the different levels. I think it's a pretty interesting conversation. There's X's and O's talk, there's scouting talk, there's analytics talk, and what he does with data, given the smaller resources, especially compared to the NBA. Neither of us are pretending to be high school basketball coaching experts or just coaching experts in general, for that matter. But I think that's kind of the cool part, is seeing how all this experience that Ben had in the NBA in front offices and clearly learning and studying the game, but where that translated, where that didn't translate, what he's learned about the high school level and is still learning about the level. I think that's the coolest part of the conversation. And at the very end, we talk about his latest project, which just came out a week or two ago. That's an X's and O's course where he's teaching, along with Gibson Piper, who's another Solving Basketball guest from the past. They're teaching X's and O's and kind of basketball theory and strategy from the ground up. The course is out now at learn-basketball.com. I'm very comfortable saying that Gibson and Ben are two of the best, if not the best, basketball analysts in the content space on the internet. Their stuff is always extremely good, and they have great experience with NBA X's and O's in particular. So again, if you're interested in that, learn-basketball.com. There's a little free preview of a section from the course on how defensive rotations work that I checked out. I'd recommend at least going to check that out. Thank you, as always, for your support of Solving Basketball and Hoop Vision, and enjoy the episode.
What is basketball? What is it? What is it? Is this basketball? Is that basketball? What is it? What is basketball?
I am now joined by the owner and operator of Cleaning the Glass, Ben Falk. Ben, thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I've been excited to do this one for a while. I think I've had some of these questions in my head for a while. I did my outline last night, but I knew what I wanted to ask. But first question of the podcast for every single guest: if we walked into a gym right now, I went under the basket, and you shot 100 free throws in a row, I rebounded for you, how many would you make out of 100?
So I want to be realistic here, and given that it's been a while since I've shot a lot of free throws with the pandemic and everything. So I think in normal times I could be like in the 75 range, but I'm going to hedge down from that and be like, I'd probably be about 65 at this point.
I was on a podcast the other day and someone asked me my own question, and I accounted for the pandemic as
Yeah.
well. And yeah, I haven't touched, I think I shot outside like once in July or something. Have you been in the gym we're going to talk about the high school team that you coach. Have you guys been in the gym at all? Or?
Yeah, so I mean, it's been not a normal season. We've had practices, but everyone's wearing masks. We're socially distanced during that, and it's not like the same as before where I could linger after and get some shots up and anything like that. So,
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, in terms of, I was thinking about this, like, this has probably been the longest stretch of my life since I started playing basketball, since I've like really been able to play. So, instead I kind of have to live vicariously through my players where you're just like, you're watching them play, you're going through drills with them, but you don't get to play the same way.
Well, 75, I mean, we've had some really good free throw shooters on. So, but 75 out of 100 is still pretty respectable for sure. So what was your playing background like growing up and in high school?
Yeah, I mean, so, I was blessed with incredible basketball genes, right? Like 5'9", never was particularly athletic. So that was a limiting factor that didn't stop me from loving the game and playing all the time and shooting around as much as I could. And it's funny because I think probably a lot of players have this experience where you feel like free throws are such a big part of the game. And so you work on your free throws. And so I had, this routine where if I should be shooting around by myself, I wouldn't let myself go inside until I made a certain number of free throws in a row. And it's only later in life that you realize that unless you have a organized playing career, that's a pretty useless skill, right? Like, and pick up, you don't shoot free throws. So, you play 21 and that's the only time that skill really comes out for me. But otherwise it's like, well, I spent way too much time drilling something that had no practical application. I mean, maybe there's some crossover, right, with shooting, but so I think that's part of why, I would have some faith in that answer as a free throw shooter.
I think from my experience, I think that shooting free throws can be kind of therapeutic. I would do it. I would just shoot 100 of them a lot when I was in high school, not necessarily even thinking about like getting that much better. Although I would usually count them and see what I was doing, but it was just like almost a stress reliever, I think.
So is that where the question comes from? Because you were always shooting 100 free throws?
Yeah, that's exactly where it comes from. Yes, and I've said all along I would not be asking this question if I didn't think I was a good free throw shooter. Like who would ask this question?
But also, I mean, who shoots 100 free throws and counts, like, knows how many they would make
Yeah,
at the end of the day?
yeah,
Like,
yeah. Okay, fair enough.
I'm
Fair
just
enough.
extrapolating from the times where, say, like, I shot 20,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But so there we go. We're digging a little deep on.
No doubt, no doubt. I
Yeah.
would either shoot 100 or see how many I could make without missing two in a row. Those were my two things,
And do you
and that's
feel like
that.
that had transfer to shooting in other places, or do you feel like it just was something to?
I these were definitely things that I would think about, but honestly, my thoughts would be it's very hard to know or measure that if it was. Early in my career, like when I was really little in middle school, I made some clutch free throws, and so in my mind, I was always a clutch free throw shooter. After that, I wanted to be the one that was fouled at the end of the game, and and you to this day, I guess, regardless of what I shoot in those, it was just like anecdotal experience early on, and I was good. So yeah,
Yeah. Well, so anyway, to answer your question, I got us a little sidetracked.
yeah.
But to answer your question, yeah. So I never played organized sports at any level since I never really was able to make the team, much to my chagrin. But I've played pickup my whole life, and it's something that I preach to the kids and our team that I coach. Is one of those things that I think is incredible about basketball is that it can stick with you for your whole life, until a pandemic. But other than that, like, I would have pickup games where I'd be playing with, 50-year-olds and like they still play. And it's something that just can be such a part. It's fun. It's great exercise. It's great camaraderie. And so, yeah, so I've always tried to keep that part of my life too.
So didn't play organized basketball, and then you wind up as, I think, initially an intern in the NBA. Can you tell the audience a little bit about how that came to be?
Yeah. So the short version is that when I was in high school, um, I stumbled on the APBR metrics message board. And at the time, all of the leaders of the field of basketball statistical analysis, um, you know, basically weren't hired by teams at that point. So they were out in the open discussing their research, and it was a great opportunity to learn from them. And then eventually, as I started teaching myself how to program and gathering stats and doing my own analysis, be able to contribute and have discussions with them, and advance that way. And eventually, when I was a freshman in college, Dean Oliver, who at the time had, at that point he had gotten a job in the NBA and he worked for the Nuggets, he posted that he was looking for interns, and so I wrote him a message and said, "I'll be your intern." He said, "I can't pay you." I said, "That's fine." Like, I'm still in school. And so I volunteered for him for basically for the summer after my freshman year. And at the end of that, he was like, "Well, I guess, we'll figure out what to do in the future." And I said, "I'll keep going during the school year." Like, my foot was in the door, and I wasn't giving that up. And so, yeah, I basically kept volunteering for him until the Trailblazers called. They called Dean and were looking for someone, and he gave my name and I interviewed. And so the beginning of my junior year of college, I was hired by the Blazers to be a part-time statistical analyst for them. And that was kind of how I got in. And when I graduated, I was full-time and moved out to Portland.
So as this is all going on, uh, how much are you into like coaching, X's and O's, that kind of thing? Did that come later? Did you always know that you wanted to get into coaching?
Yeah, so I think I got very lucky with my start, which was when Dean, when I ended up volunteering for Dean, he asked what I wanted to work on. And I talked about how I thought defense was very interesting. I have always thought that that's kind of, maybe a less understood part of the game, obviously less easily measured statistically. And so we picked a project. And because it's hard to get good statistics on the defensive end, the project involved a lot of charting. And so I watched a ton of video and charted a ton and learned a lot from Dean, just kind of through his framework of how to think about the game. And that was kind of how I started on my journey of really understanding X's and O's at a different level. I was always very frustrated that there weren't resources out there to learn it. And so, how would someone like me, just from the outside who hadn't played organized basketball, how would I be able to gain that knowledge and really get into the league? And so it really was luck that, being able to volunteer for Dean and picking that project, I really, learned from the beginning how much statistical analysis has to be married to film. You have to really be working from the ground up, understanding the game and the sport and how it works. And then again, the framework that he provided for my charting really helped me understand how to think about the game in a different way.
That makes sense. And as you moved on and worked for other people besides Dean, my perception, at least, of the NBA, especially when you were starting out, is that there was more of a divide between coaches and the data people, or really just the front office in general. Was that the case? Did you continue doing more coaching stuff?
Yeah, so I think it's a great point, is that when I first started, so I was hired by the Blazers part-time in 2008, and then I moved out there full-time in 2010. And those were still early days in the basketball analytics movement. And I think that while there were certainly things that you could do to help a coaching staff, the power of your analysis was much more limited from the coaching side. And there was a lot more that you could do from a front office perspective. And so I think a lot of people in those days, the experience was, like you're saying, your work was much more for the front office side. And that certainly was my experience. I was hired and reported to our director of, I think at the time, director of NBA scouting, Mike Bourne. And so, the work that I did was much more on the front office side. That was mostly what I did. And it actually was a good thing, because the coaching work is so consuming that I wouldn't have had the opportunity to build up a lot of the systems that we need to have built there to be able to contribute on the coaching side. When Terry Stotts came in, that was really when things changed. Terry had been in Dallas and he had worked with Roland Beach, who is the founder of 82games.com. And, Terry was great with numbers, and I mean, he's a very intellectual person. He loves getting as much information as he can and being able to factor into his decision making. And having had that experience with Roland in Dallas and seeing the impact that it made, he attributed some of their success to Roland's impact. And so he wanted that same kind of thing. And so that was an incredible opportunity for me. That was really, my opportunity to be able to contribute with the coaching staff. That first year, I did some things and we started to develop a rhythm and a cadence and what information was helpful and all that kind of stuff. And then the next year was when I was really able to contribute a lot more. So that was the 2013-14 season, once we had got that under our belt. And so that year, I was in all the coaching meetings at home. I went to all the practices, and then traveled a little bit with the team. So that really kind of, obviously it was incredible learning experience for me. That kind of took that to the next level, but also helped me see much better the places where statistical analysis could contribute to the coaching side.
I want to move ahead a little bit. I think we'll get back to, especially what you just said, where statistical analysis can contribute to the coaching side. But I want to skip ahead. So you wound up working for the Sixers, and but to kind of present day here, where you are currently a high school coach. I did a little bit of homework last night, and I think you started as an assistant coach. Is that right? So did you know after you got out of the NBA that was something that you wanted to do?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think kind of what you're getting at a little bit is once I had that taste of coaching, of being, part of the coaching staff to some degree in the NBA, I realized how much I loved coaching. There's so much about it that is intriguing from the strategy side, but also from the teaching side. And there had always been this aspect of me, I think maybe even before that, where I had thought in the back of my mind, coaching high school someday would be really fun. And just a great way to give back. I think that there's, you get all this knowledge going through the process that I went through about basketball, and it's incredible to be able to share it. And, to be able to share it and share the game that you love. And like I was saying to you earlier, like I've loved my whole life and played my whole life. And it's a really cool opportunity to be able to kind of pass that on. And so I had always had that in the back of my mind, but it didn't seem so imminent. And then, once my time in Philly came to an end sooner than I expected, my time with the Sixers, then I was like, oh, well, now I could really do anything. What do I want to do? And that popped into my mind as, at the top of the list, was just a great opportunity to see what it was like. And so, I found, a local school and asked if I could volunteer as an assistant coach. And, they had a spot. And so that's kind of how all that started.
One of the things that I wanted to ask about that is how translatable the NBA front office work was to high school coaching. But from what you just described about traveling with the team and being in coaching meetings, I mean, that's very clearly translatable. So I guess, what about for someone who is more traditionally in a front office and not doing that? Are some of the same skills still applicable?
So, I mean, I think coaching is, it's different in a lot of ways. It's just a very different beast, where in the front office, you're often looking very long-term, and you have a few big decisions that you make every year, and those have massive impact. And there's smaller things along the way, but really what you're building up toward are these few big decisions. Whereas coaching is a lot more hands-on, in the present, lots of decisions every single day. Especially in games, right? You've got hundreds of decisions, practices, and all that kind of stuff. So There's clearly this difference in timeline, but principles of decision making, understanding how to think through those decisions, and understanding the game of basketball, that definitely applies. um, I think to the larger point of your question, there's still a question, even does NBA coaching apply to high school coaching? Right?
Mm-hmm.
And what I actually found was it was surprisingly different than I expected. And the NBA is largely a half court game, and you see very little zone, very little press. And high school, at least at the level that I'm coaching at, which isn't a particularly high level, is very chaotic relative to the NBA and even college. And so it becomes very different in a lot of ways. I think my first game as an assistant coach, we faced this 2-2-1 press that just wreaked havoc on us. And I'm like, I've never seen it. I've been in the NBA. I've watched tons of film. I've never seen a 2-2-1 press, right? And so, to understand that became continuing education for me of the game of basketball. And, so I had to keep learning and understand, okay, how does a 2-2-1 press work? How do you attack it? How do we exploit it? How can we train our players to deal with this press or other presses that we might not have even prepared for? And so that changes the way that you have to think about and approach the game. But the approach of decision making and research and deep dives, and how do we think about everything that we're doing? I mean, I think there's kind of an underlying framework to thinking about the game that can apply anywhere, but it's just a foundation, and the specifics might change depending on where you are.
I want to go back to like the idea of that 2-2-1 press and not seeing that in the NBA versus in high school. But really quick, I'm sure there's plenty of high school coaches that listen and would be curious a little bit about the circumstances of your job. So do you have any control over your roster, or are you inheriting players? You kind of mentioned the level of competition. But do you have summer access? Like, how all encompassing is this as a high school job?
Yeah, so it's like, I think it's not the lowest end, but it's not anywhere near, the highest competition level. And so, it's a private school and we don't recruit. It's just you pick from the players that are there.
Mhm.
And they're out of season. There's basically no work that we do with the players. Since I ended up taking over the program, and since I took over, we've done a few summer practices, but that's basically the extent of it. And I think that there's pros and cons to that, right? The competitor in you is always looking for, oh, like I want to maximize our ability to be better. Um, but the flip side is, I mean, for my own personal work-life balance, it's a good thing to have some limits, but it's also the same thing for the kids. There's a lot of talk these days of what's too much for them. And also just the benefits of playing different sports and getting outside of just basketball training. And so this last year, we had a very good senior class. This is maybe a good capper to the press story, but so these kids, the story that I just told you, my first game as an assistant coach, these kids were freshmen, and this last year they were seniors, but they were also very good soccer players. And like basically, I think the entire senior class was on the soccer team in the fall who won the conference championship. And so, we get into the season this year, and we did a little work on press break, but I basically didn't have to work on it because the skills that they had learned from playing soccer, flashing into gaps, making quick reads, passes, passing and moving, all that kind of stuff. Those skills were there. And so, we ended up playing, I think it might have been the year before, but we ended up playing one of the very good schools in our area. And, they pressed us, and, they had potentially future Division I athletes. But we dealt with their press very well, despite them having kind of an overwhelming athleticism and talent advantage. And their coach came up to us and said after, that was as good a press break as we've seen against us this year. And a lot of that is not, I mean, obviously we've worked on it and we install some principles, but a lot of that is instinct from the players who developed that by playing other sports. And I think there's actually some research that suggests that there is that kind of transfer from those other sports. So those guardrails, I think, can to some degree be a blessing in disguise.
Interesting. As far as what you guys are running, I guess we can start with offense. What are you running offensively?
So this has been, I mean, along the same lines of the journey from, NBA X and O's to the high school level. This has also been a journey for me. So, my first year as the head coach, I came in and I thought, okay, like let's try to keep it simple and I wanted, some structure with their ability to read and react based on what was going on, on the court. But for the most part, it was more traditional X's and O's, something that you might see in the NBA. I tried to tailor it toward what fit our roster and our players. And it didn't go particularly well. I would say I didn't think our offense looked great. And some of that, is more limited skill set. But one of the things I learned is, again, at this level, the way that you teach and run offense, I think needs to be much more tailored to what the players can and can't do. And it's much more, I think it's a lot about the principles that you install as it is about any kind of X's and O's in system. And so I've tried to find that line between, giving them freedom and teaching them how to make the right decisions. But for the most part, trying to keep what we're running fairly simple. And so even last year, where we were, which was fairly successful offensively, at least was a big improvement from the year before. I tried to install some set plays, and the work that it took to get to a place where we could execute them properly in the moment, in the heat of a game against different types of defenses. The return on investment there wasn't there. It wasn't worth it. And so what I had done was I installed kind of more of a continuity, pretty simple rules-based offense, and that became our bread and butter, and that worked. That actually worked quite well. And then we would go to some sets, out of timeouts, or if in a specific situation where we're trying to exploit a mismatch. So that offense, based on the personnel that we have on the team, and also based on the philosophy that I wanted to install in the program, it's 5-out offense where everything is interchangeable. My goal is to have, all 5 players, they can kind of cater to their own strengths and weaknesses, but I still want them all to be able to shoot, dribble, pass, drive. And so we teach all those skills to everyone, regardless of, their skill set coming in. So, I mean, at a simple level, I can tell you it's just a 5-out offense where I try to have a lot of movement, and really open up gaps and driving lanes, and then try to make quick decisions and attack closeouts. And so, there's not a ton to it. It takes some experience to learn or some time to learn as I've learned trying to teach the kids. It'll take some practices to install, but once they kind of get the rules down, then it's much more about teaching them how to play within that offense. And that's kind of what I like, is it's not memorization of sets. It's not having, a huge playbook. It's just kind of a base, and then, try to get movement and some advantage creation action, and then try to teach them how to take advantage of that.
I live in the same area where I grew up, and helped my old high school coach. This is a couple years ago now, with trying to implement an offense, and then also some scouting stuff. So definitely don't have the level of experience coaching at high school as you do. But I felt like I learned a lot really quickly. So we tried to implement it wasn't the continuity ball screen that I normally tweet about a lot, if you've seen it, but it was a different ball screen continuity. And everyone just went under every single ball screen, or switch, which I think switching, we had a lot of good solutions for potentially. The under, we had some guys that could shoot. The issue was, it was going to be every possession, basically taking it off the dribble 3. If a team was really going to go under like that, and it wasn't even a bad shot, but this was a very good team. And that it wasn't the best shot. and it became very hard to run it. They had some success with it. I ended up tweeting it, and of course I tweeted all the good clips, and it looks really good when you tweet the good clips.
Right.
But going under ball screens, it's a weird thing where you can be more experimental, just like you mentioned with the 2-2-1. You can be more experimental, and then there are just certain things. The players are so good at higher levels that it requires certain things that don't happen basically at the high school level. Is that right?
Yeah, so I think it's funny you say that. So one of the big reasons why I changed our offense between my first year as the head coach and my second year, I mean, again, it didn't necessarily have the results that I wanted, but our biggest conference rival, the way they play defense, they switched every single screen, and it was this kind of like sag back and switch. So it was basically like an under to a switch. And yeah, you can't, like, we don't have the shooting, not even close, to be able to combat that. And, my first year, even, I mean, shooting is a whole separate topic. At our level, like, the 3-point shooting isn't good enough to be it. And so it makes designing offense really difficult, right? Like, how do you, I mean, the amount of time that I've spent like banging my head against the wall trying to figure out how do you score, in a situation in which your team doesn't have that many shooting threats, like that's very difficult, especially, when everyone switches. And then the fact that we don't have that much size, or we didn't have like a ton of quickness, in the sense of, I mean, I don't want to make it sound like our kids weren't good athletes. Like, for their level, they were pretty good athletes, but it wasn't like you have someone who, okay, it's obvious they're going to switch their biggest player onto our quickest player, and now we can just attack. The differences in the ability between all of our players and the size of all of our players wasn't great. So a switch didn't create any kind of mismatch, often, that you could exploit. So given that, like, not a ton of shooting, no obvious mismatch to exploit, how do you run offense? What do you do? And so I kind of like really had to go back to the drawing board and try to figure out, how do you combat this? And even to your point about, the best shots, one of the things that was interesting is our first year we had a crossover, which I think was acquired by Huddle. But, so we had an ability to gather some of these stats. And so when I went and crunched the numbers in the off season, it was like the same lesson that's honestly true at every level. And with the exception of a few years in the NBA, which is the rim is just king, right? Like, the whole game in a lot of ways is still figuring out, how do you get good shots at the rim? And especially at our level, even if you don't make it, you open up offensive rebounds, which gives you more shots at the rim. You get a lot of fouls that way. And so, how do you take a team, given everything I just described, how do you take a team and create some kind of offense to get you shots at the rim? It's not easy.
I guess the natural extension here is defensively. You talked about what works, but I guess more specifically, what are you doing defensively?
Yeah, so I think it flows from exactly what I just said, which is, like, again, we don't play a lot of great shooters, and so our biggest goal is to just wall off the paint. And so we play like, it's not principles of pack line, but it's pack line style. We try to be very aggressively in the gaps, and not allow dribble penetration to the rim, and work a lot on, help rotations, and, being in the right spots to, again, keep opposing teams away from the rim, or if they get there, be able to contest the shot well, and box out. So it's interesting because at our level, there's no shot clock, where we play, and that against a team that's pretty patient, when we're in the gaps, it creates very long, drawn-out possessions. I mean, we've had defensive possessions that have lasted minutes, which is like very crazy to observe. And so, we'll have a change of pace. I've installed some things, if we need to add some pressure and try to speed up the game, especially in moments, you get behind and you need to try to create more possessions. But our base defense, and that we really rely on and take pride in, is just really closing things off. And it's funny because, we are like, we're very proud of being able to be in the gaps. and to the point that we've had opponents think that we're playing zone. And I think I've stumbled on a quote recently. I forget where I saw it and who said it, but they said any good man defense looks like a zone, and any good zone defense looks like man at times, right? So, um, I think that's something that I try to emphasize, because I think especially at the level that I'm teaching, um, the players come up with this idea when you say man-to-man defense, it means I'm guarding this guy, and not an understanding of we need to be in help position. We're trying to make sure that they don't score, and the idea is just that you have a matchup, but you still need to be aware of where the ball is, be able to shift to the ball, understand your rotation responsibilities. And so, I liked staying with man just because I think we did have a variety of defensive ability on the team and allowed me to more specifically match up, our best defender with their best offensive player, or, basically tailor it a little more specifically to the matchup, which I think was helpful. But again, we were very aggressive trying to be in help position and take away any kind of dribble penetration.
Well, you started to mention a little bit of scouting there. So I'll give you my experience on that with that same team. We kind of installed that offense in the beginning of the season. The college basketball season started, so I went my merry way. And then during the playoffs, or what we called sectionals, I popped back in again for the first time and did some scouting of the teams in that we were about to play. And this is like the highest level of New York State. It was the semifinals and the finals. So these were good teams. And I definitely treated it like I would have when I was video coordinator at New Mexico State. But the one thing that I kept checking in with myself on, am I overcomplicating things right now? This is exactly what we would have done at the college level. But are these players really good enough to be this level of detail on the scouting report? So how much scouting do you do? And I guess, how does it compare to NBA scouting?
Yeah. So at our level, I think there are other places, conferences, who share film or have the coaches or the resources to go and, go to an upcoming opponent's game and film the game or watch the game. With us, we don't have any of that. So, sometimes I'll do, I'll search on YouTube, or I'll try to look up the stats or something and try to get some impression based on that, which can, give us some advantage going into a game against an opponent that we haven't seen before. And then obviously if we've played a team before, we can scout from that tape, and have a sense of them. The teams in our conference, oftentimes you play the same players, you see the players coming up, and you can learn their tendencies as well. But, to your question of how much you adjust, I think that's a fascinating question. And certainly I think it's every coach's instinct to want to adjust, to scout, because you feel like that's value add that you can bring. I've scouted this team, I know what they're doing, here's an ideal defense to stop what they're doing, or, here's the right way to attack this. And you run into the tension of, okay, well, how much do you stray from everything you've been practicing, and how much can these players implement something that they haven't practiced? And to be honest, that's true even at the NBA level. That's a question that we've debated in coaching staffs, which is, how much do you stray from your base defense and try to tailor it toward specific matchups, particularly in the regular season. And that we even see that in the playoffs. There's lots of debates over whether the Bucks should adjust more, or things like that. And it's a matter of, well, we do something very well because we've practiced it, we know the principle's cold, and it's instinct, versus, well, it might not be optimal against this opponent. And so certainly as you go down levels and you get to, the level that I'm coaching at, there's a danger there, which is, if we haven't worked on it extensively, then we might not execute it well. And so I tried to walk that line. Sometimes it blew up in my face, and sometimes it worked out great. But as an example, so we had, there were some opponents that we played where they had a couple of really good players and their teammates, weren't very good. And so, we tried things like, okay, should we trap? We tried things like, should you play like a triangle and two? And so we experimented with some of those things. And for the most part, that didn't work particularly well. One opponent, the way that their offense worked, they had some very good sets and screening action and some good shooters. And so I thought, oh, let's try to switch everything. And that also didn't go well because, again, it takes more experience than you think to be able to do it very well. And so if someone looks like they're setting a screen, but it's ambiguous as to whether it's a screen or not, do you switch? And it creates confusion and it's just a mess. And so what I tended to find is that preparation for opponents, I thought, was very helpful. Having our players know, some common sets that we would see, tendencies. I think we had smart players who, if you told them certain tendencies, they knew how to use that and kind of tweak their game a little bit. So that kind of preparation and understanding was helpful. And then, we could work on certain things. So the team that this last year when we played in the championship game, we had played them once before, and we noticed the tendency of their point guard to throw pocket passes on the pick and roll. He loved doing that. And so we spent, the few practices ahead of time, we played certain games where, it was extra points for the offense if they were able to complete a pocket pass on a pick and roll, with the emphasis on, we're not letting him complete this pass. We really want to be in our pick and roll defense on the weak side and be sitting on that roller and ready to take away any pass there. And sure enough, we got a steal on it in the championship game. So I think that kind of level of preparation is helpful, and so it's kind of like a small tweak away from what you've done. But at least in my experience, with my level of players, when I've tried to do anything that's more wholesale, big changes, like it often hasn't gone well.
I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but in my experiences with scouting, personally, the three head coaches I worked for were I heard some staffs, they only do the five most common plays a team runs, or it's very limited, filtered. The coaching staff is doing the full scouting, but what they're giving to the players is very limited. And we, for the most part, weren't like that. We were pretty heavy into game planning and scouting. And this is anecdotal, but I felt like we got better as the season went on with it. You improve at your ability to make those changes. It's a skill like anything else. And there were like three things that by March, first of all, we were seeing teams for the second and third time. So that's a big advantage. We were better at making those adjustments. And also everyone really cares because it's like single elimination basketball at that point. And so we were doing a lot of stuff in March that we probably wouldn't have done in November, taking away very specific plays and things like that. And so for my high school example, where I just came in at the end of the season and like, all right, we're going to try to do scouting, that it was a little bit unrealistic there, building up that habit, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I think the way you put it is very good. I'm a big believer that people from the outside often don't give credit to the value of practice. And what I mean by that is, let's say there's all these debates over, let's say, like, fouling when you're up 3 or something like that. And in my mind, a lot of that, the right answer often comes down to, what do you practice? And do you practice it? Because, the game is so chaotic, and, there's so much new being thrown at you that you often have to react off of instinct. And the way you hone that instinct is through practice. And so, so your point about being able to practice other things that aren't even on the court necessarily, like, the mental ability to process and to study, makes a lot of sense. But, with all this, so the practice, I mean, the larger point, right, is that the adjustments often are difficult because you haven't had enough practice time. But if you do put in the practice time for specific things, then I think, those are things that can be done and can be learned by players. That one of the things I realized that really just, was driven home by this experience coaching, is that practice time is a very limited resource. And that fact should guide a lot of your decision making as a coach, in my mind. Because, the way I put it is, if you have a way to become the best defensive team in your league or your conference, but it takes 80% of your practice time. And you have another scheme where you can be, say, third best, and it takes 20% of your practice time. You're probably much better off with the second, even though that means you're a worse defensive team. You now have so much more practice time to work on other things that make you better in other ways. And so the fact that you have this kind of limited resource of practice time really changes, how you should think about everything that you do. And again, we have the school that I coach at. We're not practicing all year round. We have, let's say, we have 5 days a week where we have practices or games. We have breaks for the Thanksgiving break. We have breaks for winter break. And the practice times are generally about an hour and a half. So I think relative to a lot of like higher level high school competition, we have a lot less practice time. So it's clearly driven home more for me, where I'm always wishing, I wish we had more time to do this, that, or the other. But it's true at every single level. That practice time is very limited, and you have to be careful how you spend it.
And that's, I guess, the perception about the NBA is even that way too, that they don't practice as much, right? Especially in the current NBA.
Yeah. So the NBA is kind of, the other end of the, in some ways, right? Like low level high school is here, the NBA is here, and then you have more practice time in the middle.
Exactly.
But yeah, because of the pace of games in the NBA, because of in many ways, the care that goes into, preserving the athletes and their bodies and making sure that they're in the top level shape that they can be in to perform during the games, you have a lot less time, particularly on court time, training players.
Yeah, I've said this before, but Division I college basketball to me, and at least in the US, is the most practice time, because Division III, even, you don't get summer access to your players. I've definitely heard about some European pro teams that do like 2 a day, 3 a day still. So perhaps they have Division I, but there's a lot of practice time at the Division I level, and almost to the extent some coaches go so much, you couldn't possibly be going live 100% throughout it. And so it almost allows you to do some like that might not be to your point about, of course, you should be thinking about the return on investment, but you can't go live for a 3-hour practice for all 3 hours. So we would do some like situational stuff. And maybe we were practicing too much. That's possible too. But
yeah, so I think that's interesting as well. Like, what does it mean to practice too much, and what are the negative effects? Or is there just such diminishing returns that you end up like, this isn't worth practicing anymore? But even let's put that aside for now. Like, even if you have more practice time at that Division I level, you still are on an even playing field with all of your opponents.
Sure.
So it's still who is using the practice time best has a lot of impact on your results. And so I think that same framework still applies in terms of, and even goes back to our discussion, with like set plays versus, more of a kind of system-based offense. I think initially that system-based offense is harder to teach. And so it feels like you have less control and it can look really messy. But, installing set plays and memorizing set plays, that takes a large chunk of your practice time to make sure just that they can execute it properly, with no defensive pressure, let alone, right, like when the defense is doing something different or weird or any of that. And so, is that a good use of practice time? There's certainly opportunities, and there's certainly coaches who make it look great. There's certainly opportunities to use great sets. And, I think obviously at the highest levels where maybe players have had enough practice learning those sets and being able to implement them, and they understand maybe some of the underlying reads they need to make in any given action, that can make sense. But, particularly as you go down the levels, I think there's an argument to be made that, set plays are more for the coach almost than the players or the performance of the team.
Yeah. And I guess you said in the beginning that it took so long to get something out of those set plays that it wasn't worth it. And kind of now thinking about it, we ran 5-on-0 dry offense. We had so many set plays. You needed to do that, especially the day of a game. You're running every single play that you could potentially run in that game in shoot around. I guess it kind of goes back to my point though. Like it was almost our warm up and our like, let's stop killing each other and grinding on our bodies for 30 minutes. Let's go run some set plays to an extent. And I know there's a pretty big movement within coaching against 5-on-0. Um, I do think it helps quite a bit with timing, and of course add in defenders. But a lot of the best set plays are significantly better with not just like good timing, but great timing, right?
Right. So, I mean, I think it's a very interesting discussion. I don't have any answers. These are things that I've encountered myself and tried to learn from and trying to learn as quickly as possible, on the fly, adjusting between levels. And I think it's different at different levels. It's different depending on your players. It's different depending on practice time. And there's certainly, I mean, if it wasn't successful, you wouldn't see set plays all over basketball, right? There's certainly a reason to run set plays. I do think even at the NBA level, we're starting to see some trend away from that, where you're seeing, more conceptual based offenses. I think the Warriors, they obviously run set plays, but they also do a lot of things where it's just to kind of get into concepts and, off ball screening action and things like that. They've learned so well and they know how to play out of. And you saw, I think, from the Heat this year in their playoff run, you see a lot of, it's not so much that they're running a set as it's like throw the ball to Bam, get into some kind of off ball screening action and let's play out of it. So you kind of give these, maybe loose concepts, and then be able to teach out of that so that it's much more read and react relative to the defense. And I'll be curious to see kind of how that evolves. Are you better off? Are you harder to scout? Are you more resilient as a team and able to better play against different types of defenses? Because now you've been able to take that practice time, and instead of it depending on, the coach calling out a specific set that they think will work from the sideline, now it's the players being able to just know, okay, this is the action we're running, or this is the way that it's being defended. And so this is my read. This is what I do. This is how I adjust. And it's split second and all that kind of stuff. So I think that that's interesting to me from a strategy standpoint. Then there's also just the philosophy of coaching and what are you doing as a coach? What do you want to get out of this? What do you want your players to get out of this? And that to me is also different at different levels. At certain levels, it's all about winning. For me, at this smaller private school, for these kids, I'm not trying to, we're not making a ton of money if we win a lot. The kids, none of these kids are going on to play any level of high level of basketball. Like I said, kind of at the beginning, they're going to be the play pickup the rest of your life. So part of me is I want to teach them how to play basketball, how to think basketball, how to love the game, and how to take it with them the rest of their life. And then also I want to give them responsibility and autonomy and be able to kind of, I don't want them to have to rely on me all the time. And I think that can be good from a competitive standpoint. I think we've had games this last year where it got incredibly chaotic, and in the heat of the moment, I wasn't able to do anything from the sideline. And having players who understood how to react, who had their instincts a little more honed and could make those decisions and were empowered to make those decisions, paid real dividends. But I also think it pays dividends to them as people, and just kind of having more autonomy and more ability to make decisions themselves, and less reliance on me as a coach. So, some of that is you can extrapolate and say this applies to other levels. And some of it, I think, is also just a little bit more dependent on my specific situation.
That makes sense. A big thing about the set plays and maybe why the NBA is going away, just schematically, I mean, switching to on defense certainly makes it less. I think less of an advantage to run very structured stuff, which is not any dissimilar from everyone going under the ball screens at the high school level. Yeah,
that's a good point. I also think scouting. I mean, to a previous
sure.
question, like these days with the technology that we have and the availability of video, I mean, teams, especially in the playoffs, in the NBA, they know the other stuff. They know what the other team's running, and so now being more conceptual makes you a little bit more unpredictable. So I think there's certainly value there, and I think just in general, I do think that like there's an unpredictability that comes from, being able to play off of concepts and being able to kind of have the players make their reads and decisions themselves.
One thing I definitely wanted to ask you about is shot selection. So how you're talking about shot selection with your players, and then you mentioned crossover. So what you're doing data wise or not doing data wise. I guess let's start with shot selection.
Yeah. So this was, another point of growth and adjustment for me, going from the NBA level to high school. So, when I took over as the head coach, my philosophy was I wanted them to say, if you have an open three, in rhythm, I want you to take it. I think that what's interesting is to think about how that applies at a lower level where the shooting percentages are lower. And then also the shot clock is a very big difference. So again, we don't have a shot clock. And this goes even a little bit to the last question. The shot clock at the NBA level, a shorter shot clock also means that if you run a set and it doesn't work, now you're up against the shot clock. And so being able to have some kind of concept based, a lot of teams at that point, once the set doesn't work, they don't get anything out of it. They flow into a concept based offense. Usually it's a spread pick and roll, maybe an ISO, maybe dribble handoff, something like that. And so the concept based offense on the NBA level is, well, maybe let's just get into that earlier. So at the high school level, there's no shot clock. That also changes things in terms of shot selection and, what's a good shot, what's not. So my first year, we're coming out and we have not great shooters taking, open threes, but that's not a great shot for us, especially because we have no shot clock and we could have run more offense to try to generate a better shot. And so, it ties into that, what you were asking about kind of charting stats. The most important thing that we had, the stat that I took from that stat charting was our 3-point percentage relative to our percentage around the rim. And, once you look at the numbers, it's just the rim is so much better in every single way. So like I was saying earlier, my task was to figure out how do we get more shots at the rim? And a lot of that is not, some of that is the offensive system we run, but a lot of that, as I was saying, is principles and trying to teach the players how to make better decisions around what a good shot is and what a bad shot is. And I'll say I generally, I take this philosophy from Terry Stotts, where, his mentality was, I don't want to tell a player, like, don't shoot this shot, shoot that shot, because I don't want them in the moment freezing up and being like, wait, was this a good shot? Is this not a good shot? What do I do? That kind of indecision or indecisiveness is bad for performance. You need to have players who are reacting off of instinct. And so I think instead, if you want a certain shot selection, it's where you place the players and how you train them to make those split-second decisions. So that was what I tried to focus on. That that second year was, okay, how do we shift our shot selection from taking too many threes, too many jump shots, to getting to the rim. In terms of mid-range, which I think is generally how a lot of people think about this, at our level, certainly the three was better than a mid-range shot, but it depends who the shooter is. For me, it depends contestedness, it depends rhythm, all that kind of thing. So I didn't come in with the idea of we're not shooting mid-range, or we really don't want to take these shots. I do think with a shorter high school 3-point line and based on our philosophy, we didn't have many of those situations where players were, taking a bunch of mid-range shots, particularly players who couldn't make it. I did harp on it a little bit where I would say, so we had a player who was a good driver and he pulled up, 3 steps inside the 3-point line. And I'm like, why are you taking that shot? But my point was not that the mid-range is so bad as much as I want you attacking the rim. We don't want to be set. I'd be upset if you were 2 steps back too, a little less upset, but I would still be upset. And so, my hope was to kind of try to train this decision-making into their instinct rather than have them thinking about what a good shot was and what a bad shot was. So the adjustments that we made, some of them was from a scheme standpoint, but one thing, talking to the players ahead of time and just emphasizing how important the rim was. We then drilled a lot of cutting. So off the ball, if you're spotted up, I wanted to teach them, especially the players who weren't great shooters but were good finishing at the rim. I want to teach them instinctively, your man goes to help, you cut him behind. You fill into that space behind, and that should help create layups for us. And also, again, so it's that philosophy of, I don't want them catching at the 3-point line necessarily and having to think about it. I want them to be in a position where they're catching on their way to the basket, to be able to score at the rim. So we worked a lot on cutting, when we did video work and drilled it and all that kind of stuff, so that it becomes, they understand why, they see it, and they can internalize it in the moment. But I will say, I think the biggest thing that I did was, which I think is helpful from a standpoint of, again, taking the decision making away from the players in the moment. The biggest thing that I did was created what I call a stoplight shooting system, where we classified our shooters as green light shooters, yellow light shooters, and red light shooters. And the way I did it was, we had a specific shooting drill where, depending on the number, we would do it every week, and depending on the number that they would hit, if they could get to a certain number at least once, that would bump them up to the next level. And that was based off of some of the practice charting I had done the year before, and seeing our 3-point percentages in games to know, okay, like, if you can hit this many out of this many attempts, then you're probably a good enough shooter to take these shots in games. And if you can't, then we don't want you doing that. And what that did was, it allowed us to classify, these players into different buckets and teach them some different skills, but also kind of put these rules in where it's like, if you're a red light 3-point shooter, if you catch it behind 3-point line, it's not even a thought. You don't get to take that shot in a game. And the fun part about it was seeing the growth of the players, because some of these players were, they had grown up shooting these threes their whole lives. And they just, at this point, they weren't good enough. They could make like 20 to 25% in a game, and that wasn't a shot that we wanted. And so initially it was incredibly frustrating for them in practice, and we had some funny moments. But my job was to teach them the skills to understand, how do I still be an effective player? So cutting, we talked about, as well as, catch goes, pump fakes and all that kind of stuff. I would frequently tell them, the other team doesn't know you're a red light shooter, right? Like, sell it and attack. And so, by the time we got into the middle of the season, they became a lot more comfortable with that style of play. And it really was impressive to see, some of these players who are really good rim attackers understand when to seize the opportunity, and when to attack the basket. And it really did shift our shot profile. So we got many more shots at the rim, which helped, our free throw numbers, offensive rebound numbers, and our 3-point shooting as a team went way up, in large part because the only people taking threes were our best shooters. And so overall, we did see a big offensive boost from that. And again, it kind of comes back to my philosophy of, like, we talk about it with our players, why we want them taking specific shots, but I want them, it's all about that practice. We talked about it earlier. Like, it's not something I want to tell them before a game and have them think about in the moment. It needs to be instinct.
This is sort of an obvious point, but it's also the one that I think leads to such a disconnect between, like, people that like analytics and don't like analytics. Is shot selection has been boiled down to threes and layups, and I guess free throws. Like, that's what analytics is, to a certain extent, threes and layup. And it's really just measure, track these things, and like, and I think we've talked about this in the past offline, that these things could be different values at different levels. Obviously, it's different values between players on your own team. But the thing about the NBA is the post up, I don't think it could possibly be any less valuable in any basketball environment, because the shooters are so good. There's so much talent besides the post ups, and there's, the lanes wider. Everyone has bigs that can guard the post. And where I would differentiate from mid-range is to me, maybe the mid-range shot is actually best in the NBA, where you have like a Kevin Durant or someone like that who's so skilled and can make these but the post up specifically is the one that between levels I think translates the worst. And it doesn't sound like you have a lot of bigs. Is that
No.
right?
Yeah, I mean, our tallest player at any given point is like 6'1". So we're not gonna do much out of the post. I mean, yeah, it's a fascinating conversation that we've been talking about this whole time of what is different between levels.
Mhm.
And I think it's dangerous to just take lessons from the NBA level that have been derived from the stats there and apply it at different levels. Um, you know, even to this has changed over time in the NBA. And it's
Mhm.
a result of rule changes, and there's different rules at different levels. So that's going to change things as well.
Sure.
In my mind, I wrote about this, in the new X's and O's course that I put out. I focused a lot on how the game has changed over time. And I think the simplest way that I would put it is that there used to be rules that made it so that isolation play was more advantageous. The rules changed, and isolation play and post ups are less advantageous. That doesn't mean that they're bad in any kind of absolute sense. It's just relative to the other things that you can do on the court.
Mhm.
Once the defensive rules changed and players could essentially be in aggressive help positions and zone up, and then static play became harder to score to use to score efficiently. Um, Also, I think Kevin Pelton has pointed this out, which I thought was a really good point that people haven't talked about, which is that it used to be that you could be physical with players on the perimeter and in the post. And then they changed the hand checking rules, and now you can only be physical with players in the post. And so, in the NBA, you can still, put an armbar on them and get very physical, and they're not going to call a foul. I think in college they've changed that rule, which is another reason. What are the rules in college in terms of being able to put hands on the back of a post player?
Yeah, I think it's only if you face up you can't, right? But if you are backing down, you can have an arm bar. They also have like different points of emphasis every year that kind of
Yeah.
changes
But
things.
I've
But
seen more of them calling those fouls, in the post in the college level, at the college
mhm,
level. So you not only do you have a situation where there's a larger disparity of height and talent, and size basically at the college level and particularly at the high school level, but you
yep,
also have differences in rules, in terms of what is more advantageous to use to score efficiently. So just to blindly take these lessons from the NBA and apply them down the levels is dangerous. And I knew about that, and I still even did it a little bit with that 3-point shooting, like I was saying, without any kind of data or evidence to guide you. You need to be a little bit more careful with what you're doing on any given level. And so, to bring that back to the shot selection point, um, you know, I agree 100% with you in terms of shot selection has been reduced to shot location, and that's very dangerous. And a lot of it just comes from the fact that that's what we can easily measure. So,
mm,
what's available publicly in terms of shot selection is where was the location of this shot. And so that makes it so that you can bin them easily by here's the location and this is the percentage shot in that location. And hey, this location is a lot worse than that location. And if we didn't have shot locations and instead we had contestedness, we would be, analytics movement would be pounding the drum for open shots, right? Um, you could go down the line, right? On balance shots in rhythm, like, off the catch versus off the dribble, caught in the shooter's pocket versus, a bad pass, like any of that kind of stuff. If we actually measured it well, we would have good data and you could see the differences. And there were times where in the NBA we started measuring this, even before I think some of the coordinate data was out, was contested shots at the rim. And contested shots at the rim are made at about the same rate as a wide open mid-range shot. The same effectiveness. But because we don't have that public data on contestedness, there's no one saying like, oh, this player takes so many contested shots at the rim. Now, that's a little bit of a false equivalence because a contested shot at the rim often opens up more offensive rebounds. You draw more fouls. But the point is just that, if someone's, let's say there's a bad finisher who, when they take a contested shot at the rim, maybe it's even a 30% shot, but we're not killing them for it, because that data isn't as obviously available. So in my mind, the goal is to try to take the lessons that you can, try to collect your own evidence if possible, and try to take the lessons and think carefully about how they might apply. And to shot selection specifically, understanding that an open in rhythm shot, particularly for lesser skilled players, that might matter a lot more than even the extra value of the 3-point shot.
There's a larger point here. You're explaining all the nuance and really how difficult it is to do data work from a coaching lens, at least, especially for your team, I think, right? Like I always felt this way when working for teams. We only have 15 players. We see them every day in practice and workouts and all these different things, and we get a fraction of the data on what they're doing every day. And there's only 15 of them, and there's 10 coaches. Like we have a pretty good feel for them. That it was hard for me to add a lot of extra value on our players. Not impossible, but difficult. So with your team, are you tracking it also takes a lot of work. It's time consuming to track all this stuff. And so how much is analytics a part of your high school team?
Yeah, I mean, I think I get this question a lot because of my background, and I think it's probably less than other people would expect and more than the average team at this level, right? So I mentioned we use crossover and huddle to take to capture stats of our games, which I'm able to use to get a better sense of some of those shooting numbers and just what exactly is going on with our team. I don't rely on it heavily. The sample sizes are small. The opponents can be wildly different from game to game. If we play a particularly bad team, you might even want to throw that out, right? So it's not easy to do any kind of really advanced analysis, but it's helpful to have for the kind of bigger picture takeaways, like I was just saying about the value of threes versus shots at the rim for us specifically. It would have been really hard for me to know whether those shots were good shots or not if I didn't know that we were shooting 22% rather than 32%, right? So I do that. I think that there's a lot of value in trying to chart specific things in practice. So I used that example before of our stoplight shooting. That was helpful for me to get a sense of just even a rough sense, because you see them in practice much more than you see them in the games, and you can have a much larger sample size in practice. So to have a sense that our best shooters made this many out of 25 threes on spot shooting helped me get a sense of, okay, like I can then use that as a barometer for our other players, without having to say play them in a game and have them take a bunch of threes and see whether they make them or not. So that was very helpful. And then we do something somewhat similar with free throw shooting, which is just keeping track of free throws taken throughout practice to get a sense of progression of the players. But in terms of the actual measurement, we don't do that much because it's so time consuming, and we just don't have the resources to have a big data operation at a small high school team. I think film is very important for analysis, and I think sometimes we forget that when we say there's like quantitative analysis, which is using the numbers to make decisions, there's also qualitative analysis, which is using your impression that you might not have numbers on. And qualitative data is still a type of data too. If I'm watching our practice film, as coaches, we all have takeaways from that. So putting up, again, small high school program, we don't have anyone filming our practices, but I got a GoPro and stuck it up on the wall, right? So at least we have a way where I can analyze practice. I can see what's working and not. It helps me make adjustments quicker. And it's also gives film that I can give to players for feedback. So, trying to use that, it's a type of data to use in decision making. And then trying to think through, again, these kind of larger lessons of how to make decisions in a game. How, what is your philosophy? And so that's kind of, brings us back to the beginning of the conversation, which is it's not necessarily the specific data lessons, but the, what are the relevant factors to think about? So, my player picks up his third foul in the first half, do I sit them or not? The analysis might not be the same at the high school level versus the NBA level, but the relevant factors should be in terms of how you think about fouling out your own player, how much do you trust them? Do you practice it? Do they know how to play without fouling? What's the ref situation like? What's the opponent situation like? How much do I value clutch play? All those kinds of things. And so that kind of framework can still apply. And so I think, we've talked before about statistical analysis isn't just gathering numbers and analyzing them, but it's also a framework of how you think through things with evidence. And I think that still does apply to coaching decisions.
The last thing I want to talk about here is your new course with Gibson Piper, who listeners of this podcast know he's been on a couple of times, and they're definitely familiar with him. I think the first time I heard about it was from him. He mentioned that he was working on it with you, and it was a while ago, I think. So, how long did you guys work on it? And also, I'm curious about this as someone who makes content. How did you put together a curriculum, or like the organization of the course?
Yeah. So, I mean, the genesis of this goes back to even what I was talking about earlier, which was when I was coming up, I didn't have any resources to learn X's and O's. And when I got in the league and I had the opportunity to learn them and get a sense just by, sitting in those coaches meetings and soaking up everything I could and asking questions, in my mind, I was like, this is something that would be great to give back to people to be able to create that resource. There's a lot of people doing better X's and O's work online that didn't exist when I was coming up. You get to see great hoop vision videos that really break it all down, right? Like with all the, no, I'm serious. Like that wasn't something that existed, when I was coming up. So there are those resources, but there still wasn't anyone who really had kind of taught it from the ground up. And so this had been an idea for a while in my mind. And, so I had talked about it with Gibson because, I think he does incredible work. And, I thought he'd be a great person to be able to team up with on this. And so we floated the idea and we both were like, this sounds like a good idea. And then life got in the way. And so, we slowly kind of chipped away as we had time. But there's also an aspect of like not realizing how big of an undertaking it really is. And like to your question, as you get into it and you start to think, how do you teach X's and O's from the ground up? There's a lot that goes into that. And how do you make a course feel comprehensive? Because you can't address everything. But at the same time, you also don't want it to be something that's just so overwhelming that people like can't even process it. So yeah, a lot of work went into figuring out what should go into it. How do you teach this? What's the right framework to think about it? And then obviously, writing it, putting together the film. Gibson did an amazing job kind of leveraging his video library and his editing skills to really kind of show everything on film. And so far we've gotten good feedback from people who have taken the course and, they've loved it and they felt like it did kind of guide them the way that we wanted. So that's good to know because it's hard once you know something to be able to then understand what it's like to not know it. But that was kind of the approach, was to really try to put that hat on as much as possible and say, okay, how do you create a structure for someone to really understand, the ins and outs of NBA X's and O's?
I would imagine that doing that, organizing that, building the curriculum is pretty helpful for you too, right? Like whether it's as a coach or just thinking about basketball. Sometimes I struggle going to write something because I'm still like thinking it through, still learning about it. And then all of a sudden things start to click, especially with my big thing is always talking about the trade-offs of everything. So the good and the bad. And sometimes you only understand one side at first, and I've found that creating content can make it for a clear understanding.
Yeah, I think for sure when you write something, it forces you to put structure around it. And that structure can clarify things in your head. And so it definitely was the case for me, as we're trying to put it all together, understanding kind of the structure of how the game works and like really thinking about the idea of there's these kind of core actions that happen in a game, whether it's a ball screen or an off ball screen or a handoff or a post up, and that those get combined in certain ways to create sets. That structure I think is interesting. There also just were a lot of little learnings that I kind of knew in the back of my mind. And then as I'm putting them into the course, I'm like, oh, there's like some interesting connection going on here. One of them I think is fascinating is kind of the rise of Mike D'Antoni's style in NBA offense with pistol action and delay and that kind of stuff, which is, very much featured by D'Antoni and now has swept the league. And what does that mean? It's a lot of simple actions that are, quick decisions based on trying to get optimal spacing. And it does a little bit flow more into what we were talking about earlier. It's a little bit more conceptual. I think D'Antoni has long been a proponent of erring on the side of kind of simplicity and concepts and principles and thinking about spacing and timing, rather than any kind of intricate, very complicated set plays. He has those, I think, in his toolbox, but he's kind of emphasized that, and that's what has worked, and it has really swept the league. And so, kind of as you start to put to paper some of these trends that have happened in the NBA and try to explain them, you start to, at least for me, I started to see some of these themes that kind of ran through the whole work. The other big one was the evolution. We talked about this earlier, the evolution of the NBA over time, and the rule changes that led to it. Because as I'm writing through all these different sections in the course, you start to realize, oh, I keep saying this again and again. It didn't used to be this way, but now it is. And here's why. And it really is, we talk about the modern NBA, but it really is true that the game is very different from what it was decades ago. And some of that's rule changes, some of that's technology and really the global influence of the game. And, you put it all together, the being able to measure things a little bit better and understand what's more efficient, better technology to be able to, pull in concepts from all around the globe and kind of, bringing in global coaches and that influence turning into a melting pot in the NBA. And then the rule changes, which have made it so that, like we talked about earlier, relatively you have movement and multiple player actions being more efficient. That combination has really created the modern NBA X's and O's.
For the listeners, the course is at learn-basketball.com. Nice URL branding there. That's good stuff.
Wanted to make it easy.
Learn-basketball.com. Ben's on Twitter at Ben C. Falk. And of course, cleaning the glass too. But thank you so much for coming on, Ben. I really appreciate it. I for a long time, I wanted to have the NBA guy on and just talk high school basketball. I take pride in the nichiness of this podcast. So I really wanted to have the NBA guy on and talk high school basketball the whole time.
Well, I loved it. This was exactly the conversation I wanted to have. I mean, I think anyone in the coaching world knows that we all just love sitting down and just getting deep into the weeds and the little decisions about coaching. It's so much fun to talk about. So this is a great opportunity to talk about it with you.
Thank you.
No hand checking. Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, Tony Kukoc.
That was cringe basketball. I couldn't even watch that.